Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about something that I've wanted to cover for a long time, and that is national board certification. And specifically, I want to just present kind of an overview of what the process really entails and do so really clearly and concisely because when I was pursuing national board certification as a candidate, I kind of felt like I was trying to feel my way around in the dark. There was a lot of figuring out that I had to do. So my goal is to present like kind of a map or a blueprint of what the process really entails. So that way people going into um, certification or pursuing certification really know what to expect and what they're supposed to do. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So national board certification is composed of four different components. I personally think it should be five components, but you'll see why I think that in just a second. The first one that I'm going to talk about is C2. And yes, these are going to be in a weird order that makes sense to me. And then next, we're going to talk about C4, and then we'll talk about C3, and lastly, C1. All right, so why in this order? Well, I find that C2 and C4 are pretty similar, at least in the way the components are structured. It's a lot of writing. It's a pretty big portfolio. So those two are similar in that regard. C3 stands out in being the um, only component for a lot of the disciplines where you have to submit video recordings. It's also worth more than C2 and C4. So it's a bigger part of your portfolio score. And then C1 is kind of in an island by itself because it's not a portfolio assessment. It is a kind of a traditional sit down and, you know, by yourself and you're taking a test. And there's the multiple choice and then there's the constructed response. And we'll get into both of those when we really delve into C1. And yes, I am using Microsoft Paint. Very old school, makes me nostalgic. Let's go ahead and zoom this in a little bit though. So C2 is all about differentiating instruction. So what does that really mean for National Board? So first of all, C2 is going to involve either a small group or it's going to be a one-on-one lesson. So when I pursued national boards, I did the exceptional needs specialist, which is special education, and RC2 was one-to-one instruction, and we did an intervention with that particular student and track their progress. So for the other disciplines, and this is for like um, ELA, math, science, etc., it's going to be a small group. So whether you're focusing on a small group or um, a individual student, you are going to have to show mastery of the assessment instruction cycle. And that's the diagram that I am drawing right now. So the first thing that you're going to need to do for C2 is you're going to need to determine the needs of your student or your small group. So what skill do they really need to work on? And how are you going to determine that skill? Well, you're going to determine that through assessment data. So this is where the assessment part comes in. And then once we have all that data, we've analyzed it, we have determined what we're going to teach our student or students. We're going to go ahead and teach them whatever skill we've determined we need to teach them based on the assessment data. Okay, so we've taught them. How do we know we did a good job? Well, we assess them. Okay, So I am kind of being facetious. We may have done a great job, but our students are, still struggling. But regardless, the assessment is going to help illuminate what your students still need to work on or what they're still confused about. And then that's going to give you valuable information that you're going to use in your instruction. So around and around we go, assessment and instruction, and it's a continuous cycle. So that is a huge part of C2 is that continuous assessment and instruction, um, and how you continually use assessment data to inform your instruction. All right, so how are we going to slay C2? How are we going to just knock it out of the park? Well, you're really going to have to set yourself up for success with C2. You're going to need to first determine a student need that you can track their progress across time. Okay, so this needs to be a very specific need. It needs to be a measurable need. It needs to be a skill that they need to work on. Okay, and then you're going to want a assessment. National Board calls it an assessment tool that you're going to use over and over and over again. So this is going to need to be an assessment that you can use in your instruction repeatedly. Okay, so this is not like a one-off assessment where like, the students do the assessment and they're done and you all feel really good about yourselves. No, this is something that you're going to use to track student progress across time. Okay. In a later video, I'll talk about some different assessment tool ideas that you can use to really succeed with C2. All right, let's go ahead and talk about C4, which is the component that I really think should be two different components. And here's why. The first part of C4 involves unit design. So you are planning and teaching a unit based on your students' needs. You're planning and giving a formative and summative assessment. And this is a multi-objective unit. So you're showing how well you can structure a unit of instruction. The next part, or the other part of C4, is called participation in learning communities. And it's a super vague, and there's two main components of participating in learning communities. There is your student need, or rather your student learning need. That's the full name of it. And then you also have your professional learning need. So with student learning need, this is all about something that your students need to work on. Perhaps they have a skill gap that needs to be addressed, and it's not just your students, it's like the other teacher students, it's across the entire grade level. And what you do is you participate in professional development, you learn about certain strategies that could help bridge that learning gap, and you show that you've done that for yourself and your colleague students. And then we have the professional learning need, which is all about your professional learning need. So, what do you need to work on? It's the time to be vulnerable. It's the time to, recognize that you don't have all the answers. And this is the opportunity to show that you're reaching out, you're collaborating with others, you're seeking professional development to meet that professional need. And you're showing that doing so had a positive impact on students. So this is like before and after you address the need. Um, so all this right here that I just discussed is completely separate from the unit that you're designing. Okay, that's why it's frustrating that it is all lumped together as C4 when really there's no relationship between these two branches of C4. Now, you can make your participation in learning communities related to your unit. Like, say you're teaching a unit on um, adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. So that's what your unit's about. Um, and you find while you're teaching the unit that your students really don't have a solid understanding of basic fraction concepts. So they don't understand that, like, the numerator or the denominator getting bigger means the fraction gets smaller. So they're doing things like, or they're thinking things like 1 over 8 is bigger than 1 over 4 because like 8 is bigger than 4. Okay, so you're teaching your unit on fractions and you discover this learning need and you decided to seek professional development and yada, yada, yada. So, yes, it can be related to your unit, but it doesn't have to be. You could be designing a unit on, well, let's use the same one, adding and blah, 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 adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators, but you decide to seek professional development on SEL needs because your kids give up on certain problems because they get frustrated really easily or they're afraid of being wrong, and you decided to address that social emotional learning need, right? It's not completely related to your unit design. Well, not really at all, but it's still part of the same component. Um, so that's C4 in a nutshell. All right, so next we're going to look at C3. And the first thing worth mentioning about C3 is is how much of the portfolio score it counts for. So C3 is 50% of the entire portfolio section, which is more than C2 and C4, which are both 25%. So C3 is pretty much the same as C2 and C4 combined. So if you're going to shine on one section, C3 is the component to shine on. So what do you have to do for C3? As far as I know, C3 is the only component for most all of the disciplines. Like I know ENS, ELA, math, science, social studies. It's the only one where you have to do a video. If I'm wrong about that, feel free to correct me. But C3 is all about teaching in the moment, which is why, of course, you have to have a video of that, right? Um, so C3 is mainly two parts. And thankfully, these two parts are very closely related, unlike the two parts in C4. So the first part is all about lesson planning, and the other part is about responsive teaching. And what do I mean about responsive teaching? I mean those like in the moment teacher moves where you're tracking the student's progress in the moment, and based on how the student is understanding, you give them feedback and then the student acts on that feedback. So you're really looking closely at those in the moment interactions where you as a teacher show responsiveness. So yeah, this is what C3 is really all about. Can you use your knowledge of students and their needs to design a lesson with a clear structure, a clear objective, and a clear assessment? And can you show in the moment that your students are engaged, that you are engaging them, that you're tracking their progress, you're assessing them, and you are responding to their emergent needs in the moment? Those could be clearing up a misconception, that could be helping students build on their understanding, things like that. All right. And last but certainly not least is C1. So the first thing worth mentioning about C1 is again the total weight of the component. It's 40% of your total score. And that is compared to 60%, which is the portfolio section, which is 2, 3, and 4 combined. So it might look like it counts less than the portfolios, but you have to consider that this is all three portfolios combined, and this is a one-off test. So a single test, you're sitting down for this test, it's going to take just a little while, or it's going to count for 40% of your score. So it's definitely something that you really, really want to do well on, and something that you want to prepare for as much as possible. So let's talk about that. All right, so there are two major components on C1. The first component is the multiple choice general knowledge questions. And these are going to depend on your discipline. So, for example, my discipline was ENS or special education. And so my questions obviously focused on special education topics. So, if you're a math teacher, you're an ELA teacher, then you're going to expect uh, questions that assess your general knowledge about teaching in that discipline. The other section is the constructed response questions. So these are your, I want to call them essay questions because you're doing a little bit of writing for these. And for these questions, you're going to be given a scenario. It's going to be a very vague scenario. For example, you are teaching um, students with disabilities a math lesson on measurement. What are you going to teach and how are you going to assess them? There are so many different ways that you can answer a question like that. What really matters is that your examples and details are really specific and show that, frankly, you know what you're doing, that you know how to assess whatever skill you are teaching, and that you know what strategies work for whatever skill that you're teaching. So the cool thing about the constructed response questions is that you're pretty much going to know what they are ahead of time. You're going to get practice, especially if you're in a mentorship cohort or program. You're going to get practice questions, and the questions that are on the actual assessment are going to be almost exactly the same as the practice questions. So they're really easy to prepare for. And if you practice enough times, then you're going to end up with a like a template in your head of how to answer the questions. And it's going to be super easy when you're actually sitting down to take the test. You'll already know what to say to answer the question, which is a really nice feeling. It's a lot better than drawing a blank. Um, Unfortunately, the multiple choice questions are a lot harder to prepare for. National Board jealously guards their multiple choice questions, so there isn't like a test bank out there where you can find practice questions. The publishers of major test prep books don't have access to them, so you really have unfortunately no way of totally preparing for the multiple choice questions. The best way to ensure that you do well on this section is to just make sure that you are well versed in the major pedagogical topics in your field. That's I know that's really unhelpful, but yeah, the multiple choice questions, that's a tough one to prepare for. Well, that kind of ended on a somber note with the multiple choice section not being something that you can totally prepare for. But the good news is that with the rest of national boards, you have complete control. It's just you kind of have to crack the national board code. You have to know exactly what they want. And I'm hoping that this video was at least a little bit helpful in clarifying what national boards is looking for. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was informative, and I will see you in the next one.